is British Columbia still persecuting churches who opened their doors during COVID lockdowns? It's a good question. And to discuss it further, I bring you an interview with Mike de Jong, who recently raised that very question in the legislature.
We saw the transmissibility of the virus increasing, and what we were seeing was that there was transmission in a number of faith settings despite having those measures in place. So that spoke to us about there was something about those interactions that meant that the measures that we thought were working were no longer good enough to prevent transmission of the virus in its highly transmissible state during the winter respiratory season. And so it was because of that we put in additional measures to stop the in-person services starting at the end of November.
We use the word reconciliation a lot around this place, and for good reason. Isn't it time that the government tried to reconcile with the law-abiding and, yes, by definition, God-fearing folks who drew on their faith during a very difficult time and couldn't understand why they could go to a Pilates class but couldn't go to church? Those proceedings have now been going on for 3 years, over 3 years. And the government, I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, has spent a fortune on multiple applications, sometimes appearing in court with 5 lawyers.
Drea Humphrey here with Rebel News, and I bet many of you didn't know it, but BC's NDP government is still prosecuting some of the churches that practice their right to religious freedom during BC's selective COVID lockdowns. That's right. Abbotsford's Emmanuel Covenant Reformed Church, Langley's Riverside Calvary Chapel, and Chilliwack's Reformed Church legal troubles with the state are far from over. If you recall, after unelected public health officer Dr. Bonnie Henry used her sweeping powers to criminalize in-person worship while keeping bars, restaurants, and wineries like the one she co-owns open, the trio of churches were slapped with hefty fines and vilified by state media for safely opening their doors to those who didn't want to forsake such worship, just like the Holy Book commands them not to do. Rebel News covered how the churches even brought forward a constitutional challenge against the government for the biased treatment, which was sadly dismissed. And the appeal to that case wasn't even permitted to be heard. Next month, they'll be further represented by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms for an abuse of power application. And the hearings will deal with whether 2 of the churches, like the third, will also be found guilty of breaching Henry's orders. And if so, they will face convictions. One of the very few politicians across the country to say a peep about such discriminatory mandates during lockdowns was Abbotsford West's Mike de Jong, who was serving at the time with BC United. De Jong raised the ongoing prosecution of churches during question period last week.
Fired healthcare workers aren't the only people feeling stigmatized by this government. 3.5 years ago, I wrote to the then Attorney General, now Premier. I wrote to explain how I was being contacted by faith-based groups across British Columbia who were confused and frustrated that at a time when public health orders were being changed to allow people to attend things like Pilates and yoga classes, that absolutely no accommodation was being made for people who wanted to safely gather and exercise their constitutional right to worship.
Joining us now is Mr. de Jong himself after serving as an MLA for 30 years. Thanks for being on Rebel News.
Good to be here.
Now, we'll tell everybody what's next for you towards the end of this, but I want to dive right into the purpose of this report first. One of the last issues you raised in the House was the fact that there are still some churches that were in the riding that you were serving specifically who are being prosecuted by the government for having their doors open during lockdowns. Why was it important to raise that issue?
Well, first of all, it was a surprise. We all recall those days back in 2020, and there was a lot of concern, a lot of fear. And then as we got into the early part of 2021, when the health orders started to change, and when I became involved in this, the concern that these and other churches were expressing was, look, we're having trouble explaining and understanding the inconsistency between a circumstance when I can go to a Pilates class, or I can go to a yoga class, or I can go to a pub, or I can go to a food court, but I'm absolutely banned from going to church. And I shared that concern. I too couldn't understand that basic inconsistency between these sorts of activities, and I raised it then with then Attorney General Eby. When I found out that the cases were still being prosecuted and that the government was still trying to extract money out of these churches some 3.5 years later, that just struck me as unreasonable, and I wanted to confront the government with it.
I don't think a lot of people realize that it's still ongoing, even when it comes to the lingering COVID vaccine mandates against healthcare workers. I've gone on the street and asked people, and they have no clue that there are still any type of mandate in place. And same with this issue, that this is still happening. Now, when you raised that question in the House, Attorney General Nikki Sharma said the following.
My question to the Premier is this: how is it in the public interest to continue spending huge amounts of public money to prosecute, to persecute churches and churchgoers whose only sin was to try and administer to the spiritual needs of their communities?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll take that question on notice. And of course, I can't talk about things that are before the court right now.
She says the matter is before the court. She cannot comment. You're a lawyer. You were serving with BC United as the shadow minister for Attorney General. Is that true? Is there more she could have said and more she should have said?
A predictable response. I can't say I was overly surprised. Look, I think that what we expect of our political leaders, and the Attorney General and the Premier are no different, is to set broad policy guidelines, and the Attorney General is still certainly capable of doing that. My point to her, that I thought she was entirely capable, and her and the Premier should have responded to, is we use the term reconciliation a lot in politics, in governments now. Isn't this a case where reconciling what took place is important, where it's time to move on? It's time to recognize that and not punish people who are, by any definition, law-abiding citizens, by definition, law-abiding, God-fearing citizens, who don't want to disobey the law, but were put in a position through orders that didn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people at that point in time. And it's unfortunate that neither the Premier nor the Attorney General saw fit to offer comment.
Yeah, you're right. There is a lot of talk of reconciliation, a lot of talk of inclusion, and Canada is supposed to be a place of freedom. You talk about how during lockdowns we knew that restaurants were open, we knew that there were certain type of exercise activities, but some of the churches I covered, for example, one that it will be in court over this issue, Riverside Calvary, they were wiping down everything. They had families totally social distance. It wasn't allowed. Why were politicians so quiet then when that was happening, when they could see on the news these churches were getting fined? And I even captured them, putting their heads down in shame as they entered their own places of worship.
Yeah, it's a good question about why silence prevailed. When I wrote, as I did in January 2021, to then Attorney General Eby, over the course of a 4-page letter, it said to him, please explain this inconsistency and why there is no attempt being made to accommodate an activity that is constitutionally protected. I'm all for Pilates. I don't do it, but I applaud people that do. But going to Pilates class is not a constitutionally protected right. Going to church is. And the fact that no attempt was made at that time in those circumstances to accommodate the attempts that these churches were being made to keep people safe, but also meet their spiritual needs, I think needs some explanation and needs to be answered for. Whether that'll happen during these court proceedings, I guess we'll find out. The Crown and the government are now facing allegations of abuse of process. That'll be litigated, as your viewers know, here in the weeks ahead.
Well, hopefully, freedom of religion prevails. We've covered, unfortunately, many times, including with matters of medical conscience. It hasn't been prevailing in the courts. I know you can't give us an exact figure here, but you do raise the issue of the province paying money to go after these churches to continue this process. What do you think a ballpark would be on how much money that would be?
Two components to this, and I've read many of the submissions and the decisions, and I've seen at times the government, the Crown, had upwards of 5 lawyers representing various departments of government. To suggest that this is a bill approaching $1 million, never mind the cost to the churches themselves, and that has been significant. The point I tried to make in the Legislative Assembly was, at a time when people's concern about basic elements of public safety and what is taking place in our street, and this revolving door of repeat offenders, surely there is a better way to be spending finite resources within our justice ministry. And to my mind, chasing churches 3.5 years after the fact in these circumstances isn't the wisest use of that money.
Mm-hmm. Well, let us know in the comments if you agree. Also, if anybody's watching and they want to know how to support these churches, they are being represented by lawyer Paul Jaffe, who I've interviewed before, through the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I have that information linked in the written article for this report below. Now, let's end. What's going on with you next? I see that you are wanting or running for the federal Conservatives. Tell us about that.
Well, a couple of years ago, I heard Pierre Poilievre talk about something that not a lot of politicians or leaders were prepared to talk about, and that is basic elements of fiscal responsibility. That would appeal to me probably doesn't surprise anyone that's seen me in the past. For 5 years, I was BC's finance minister and tabled and delivered 5 successive balanced budgets. I think governments in the ordinary course of affairs should live within their means, and a whole bunch of good things can happen and will happen in terms of protecting taxpayers. That seemed to go out of fashion for a while, and Pierre Poilievre, wisely in my view, has talked a lot about returning a sense of responsible fiscal management to government. That appeals to me. After 30 years in the provincial legislative assembly, a lot of conservatives, Conservative Party of Canada members here in the Lower Mainland, came to me and said, Mike, there's a mess that needs cleaning up in Ottawa, and we think you're someone that can help clean up that mess. And so I'm pursuing the nomination. We'll see how that goes. It's the response has been very, very positive. We got a great country, and the fact that the present government has taken us down a path that the vast majority of people don't approve of doesn't mean we can't rescue this country, doesn't mean we can't make Canada fulfill all the potential that it has, and I'd like to be part of that.
Well, there you have it, Mike de Jong, on the continued persecution of churches in British Columbia. I'm Drea Humphrey with Rebel News. During lockdowns, no other news outlet had their boots on the ground like Rebel News to show you how Christians were being persecuted for practicing their faith. We even have a tell-all documentary about just that. And if you haven't already seen it, it's called Church Under Fire. Go to our special website called SaveTheChristians.com to watch and share that documentary. And if you feel led to, you can donate a few bucks to help cover the expenses to bring it to the world.